So now um, in legal terms, sometimes circumstantial evidence is distinguished from what's thought of as direct evidence. So direct evidence might be a author saying, I saw this happen, or this happened. He directly testifies. So suppose in the Gospels, for example, we have all four Gospels tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000. That's direct evidence that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred. They all say that it occurred, although they have different details and different wording. Circumstantial evidence is some other kind of evidence that might, for example, confirm the direct evidence or confirm the truthfulness of the author.
But that doesn't actually happen. In fact, there was a big mix-up in Mark with the two feeding of the masses stories. You see, the author of Mark thought that these two different versions of the exact same miracle were actually two totally different stories. They weren't, he just included them both in his narrative. This would be direct evidence if, and only if, the Gospels were considered eyewitness accounts. They aren't, nor are they based on eyewitness accounts. They're actually based on what the scriptures say. In the Old Testament, which is what the scriptures would be at this point, both Elisha and Elijah have spontaneous generation of food as a miracle that they both perform. Jesus, being the ultimate prophet bro as he is, has to come in and do all of the same miracles that the prophets before him did, but he's just got to do them bigger and better. There's actually more evidence that this feeding of the multitudes, or feeding of the masses, is more likely based on the Old Testament scriptures than on the event actually happening. Lydia then goes on to explain how circumstantial evidence can actually show us how truthful a statement is. This is a really bad conclusion to come to because the circumstantial evidence can't actually tell us anything about the truthfulness of someone's testimony. The best that you could say, it's just not evidence against the testimony. Evidence really can't have an effect on the truthfulness of the testimony unless it can prove that testimony wrong.
We have more undesigned coincidences connected with the feeding of the 5,000 than with any other incident in all of Scripture, which is kind of interesting. So that's kind of interesting that the circumstantial evidence actually helps to confirm the direct evidence.
In this previous section, I did have a cut in the middle of it, but all it was Lydia reciting some quote from J.J. Blunt, the originator of this argument. He doesn't really provide anything other than his opinion on how circumstantial evidence factors into proving miracles can happen. Again, she just says that the circumstantial evidence confirms the direct evidence. But in actuality, in the context of the Gospels, it doesn't actually affect the truthfulness of the claims. Because this supposed circumstantial evidence could have been generated by the gospel authors reading the earlier gospels and then creating a narrative that seemed to fit what was already known to the population. This is because the supposed circumstantial evidence could have been generated because the later authors had already read Mark's account. Let's see what kind of undesigned coincidences she thinks exist in the Gospels. She didn't really give us any kind of evidence about this feeding of the masses, so I wonder if she'll go further into that or if she'll give us different examples.
So I've been doing, for example, a lot of work on the Gospel of John recently. I have some connecting John with what are called the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Lydia then goes into a detailed explanation of an undesigned coincidence that exists concerning the feeding of the masses in both Luke and John. Basically, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is looking to feed these 5,000 people, he turns to Philip and says, "Hey, yo, where do we buy this bread at?" And the question here is, why did Jesus ask Philip? Out of all of the disciples that he could have asked, he specifically asks Philip. Well, it just so happens that if you go to Luke, you find out that this feeding of the 5,000 actually happened near Bethsaida. And then later on in John, in a totally different context, you find out that Philip is from Bethsaida. Given these two interlocking aspects of these Gospels, Lydia comes to this conclusion.
It does not appear that these authors are attempting to confirm one another, but they do confirm one another.
Actually, it seems more like John just read the other Gospels, or it was already common knowledge that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida and that Philip was from Bethsaida. This is also supported by the fact that John was most likely written in the 2nd century, and so therefore he could not have been an eyewitness to this event. Another big problem with John's account of the feeding of the 5,000 is that his particular event takes place on a mountain, while all of the other events in the Synoptic Gospels take place by the sea. This is just simply a fact that shouldn't have changed. Nothing presented here by Lydia shows that this feeding of the 5,000 actually took place. It most likely proves that John definitely read Luke in order to craft his narrative. Lydia has to make 2 presumptions here that she really doesn't have support for. One is that both of these accounts, both John and Luke, were either eyewitnesses to the event or were working off of eyewitness accounts. And 2, that they were completely independent of each other. Now, the only source that is cited by either of these Gospels is Scripture. So there's no way to establish that they were independent or that they used eyewitnesses or were eyewitnesses themselves. This is what I mean when I said that this argument seems circular, because you had to presume the independence and reliability of the Gospels in order to prove the independence and reliability of the Gospels.
What's like the number one pushback that you get to this example?
Well, I don't know about this example particularly, but I do see, and let me just say, scholars are not really answering this. I mean, scholars who are skeptical or whatever aren't.
They're not engaging it.
They're not engaging it. Bart Ehrman had an engagement with my husband on the Unbelievable show a few years ago, supposedly about this. And like the strongest thing that Bart Ehrman said was, well, this sounds very 19th century.
Because this is an old argument that's already been dealt with? Aside from apologists like Lydia here, this argument is not used to establish the reliability of the Gospels. The evidence actually suggests that these undesigned coincidences are really not undesigned or coincidences. They were designed because the Gospel authors read the previous Gospels and then crafted their own narrative using those Gospels.
There are 2 kinds of objections that I get from popular skeptics, sort of popular objectors. One is what I call the hyper-subtle deceptive author objection, and the other is what I call the source objection.
I think the hyper-subtle deceptive author objection is the one that I brought up. Although I wouldn't really classify the author of John to be hyper-subtle or deceptive. I think he was creating a narrative for his community and for the message he was wanting to push. He wasn't trying to deceive anyone.
So the hyper-subtle deceptive author is that in this case, the way that would go would be that John, he just like super subtly put that in about Philip being from Bethsaida in these other passages because he was sort of hoping that people might later make these connections to Luke. Now, I consider that extremely implausible because it could so easily fail. When people try to confirm their own accounts, they're not generally that subtle when they're making something up. If he wanted to try to put that in there, he could easily have said, now Philip was from Bethsaida, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And this was taking place near Bethsaida. And so Jesus said to Philip, where near here can we buy bread? But he doesn't do anything like that. That type of hyper subtlety is not characteristic of forgers and people who are faking things. Because honestly, you could have all your work for nothing.
No, I think that it was most likely just common knowledge that Philip was from Bethsaida. She makes the false dichotomy that John is either lying or is being truthful. He could have believed wholeheartedly in the story that he was telling that it actually happened. She doesn't consider that or the timeline in which the Gospels are known to have been written in. Her idea that these details prove anything has to presume that John was written at the exact same time as Acts, as well as all of the other Gospels, as well as Paul. We know definitively that this is not how they were written. We know that the Gospel authors read and copied each other. Her other objection that she gets a lot is the supposed source objection, and that's basically just inventing some other gospel that all of the gospel authors used in order to write their narratives. Just like with the Q document, I really don't think that there's any kind of evidence that would be able to distinguish Mark from this source. Even so, this source objection is far more likely than the idea that all of the Gospels and Paul were written at the exact same time. They were completely independent of each other, and that these two Gospels, Luke, Acts, and John, accidentally corroborate each other.